This audio is recorded by JohnLothe. It's intended for educational purposes. If you find value in these works, and if you'd like to assist me in the production of these recordings, head over to my website where you can donate as little as $1 to help me continue making these. I really appreciate all your help. Thanks for having a look and a listen. Your friend, JohnLothe. Between Two Ages by Zbigniew Brzezinski. Ideas and Ideals Beyond Ideology. The 19th century can be said to represent the intellectual supremacy of the idea of liberty, but the 20th century is witnessing the triumph of equality. For most people, liberty found its political embodiment in the nation, and only for relatively few was it in procedural guarantees for the individual. The last century was, therefore, primarily the time of nationalism, and only secondarily of liberal democracy. The search for forms in which the idea of equality can be expressed is currently the strongest motivating impulse behind the activities of university students in the West and of youthful critics of the privileged communist elites. It also guides relations between blacks and whites, both in the United States and in Africa, and between the richer and the poorer countries. We have thus reached the stage in mankind's history where the passion for equality is a universal, self-conscious force. What is more, since equality is not likely to be attained on the objective plane, it may be sought more and more on the subjective plane. With real equality impossible, equality through emotion becomes a substitute, with passionate conflict and hostility creating the illusion of equality. The quest for equality. The passion for equality is strong today because, for the first time in human history, inequality is no longer insulated by time and distance. Nationalism spread during a century and a half as populations gradually became politicized, as a side effect of literacy and industrialization. But the rejection of inequality within and between nations has become the dominant mood in a mere matter of decades. In this regard, as in the rebellion of the younger generation, the appearance of global communication and of newly educated masses is the decisive stimulus. Accordingly, the relationship between the technotronic age and the passion for equality, if not the idea of equality itself, is quite casual. From the standpoint of generating social and political motivation, it is a matter of enormous import that the poor live as much in the new software multi-billion-dollar service environment of world information as the wealthy do. National oppression and class oppression had to be direct and personal before they could generate counter-reaction. Today, the sense of inequality can be vicarious and nevertheless extraordinarily intense, because it can be magnified beyond the level of personal experience. But though the commitment to the idea of equality currently commands the greatest allegiance, the definition of equality remains elusive. In the communist states, the struggle for political equality involves the desire to do away with the right to rule as a privilege of only a few, with the right to read and to travel freely as a professional prerogative of only those at the top of the power elite, with the right to buy what one desires as an advantage enjoyed only by those on government assignments abroad or with access to special stores for high officials. Nevertheless, Communist Party leaders, who have long assumed that the elimination of propertied classes would automatically ensure social equality as the basis for personal liberty, find this desire for libertarian equality difficult to comprehend. In the new and developing states, the difficulty in defining equality is compounded by the fact that in most cases, complaints result not only from immediate social inequities, but from an acute sense of deprivation vis-à-vis the developed world. The small size of many of the new states further intensifies their feeling of impotence and complicates the task of redress. Their economic dependence on unstable commodity markets and foreign capital means that their liberty is highly relative and tenuous. The result is a condition in which liberty seems threatened by the absence of international equality. It is the desire for equality that has made most of the leaders of the new states embrace socialism. They see in socialism a vehicle for ensuring the objectives which most of them share: the flowering of their nation's own distinctive cultures, national economic development, and the gradual erosion of internal and external inequality. Their socialism shares the Marxist analysis of capitalism and the Leninist description of imperialism, though the leaders tend to stress that their economic approach avoids the errors not only of capitalism, but of communism as well. Indeed, some leaders have claimed that their socialism, less dogmatic and enriched by indigenous traditions, would provide the world with a more humane alternative than either the doctrinaire materialism of communism or the social indifference of the corporate West. Writing just before the attainment of independence in Kenya, Tom Mboya, in discussing the African concept of socialism, declared that eventually Africa, quote, will show the rest of the world what freedom really means, closed quote. These views, however, remain essentially unstructured and unsystematized. Though they have been described by some scholars as an ideology, they tend to lack the systematic, coherent, integrated, and intellectually sustained character of either socialism or communism, and there is an absence of formal dogmas and institutional embodiment. Though they back their views by undemocratic political power and phrase them in a terminology largely derived from Marxism, and though they are necessarily preoccupied with improving man's economic life, the leaders of the new nations tend to lay stress on the preeminence of nationhood and on the spiritual importance of the human being. This is also true of the new indigenous intellectuals, those in the social layer immediately below the present third world leaders, who tend to be even more radical in their outlook, more susceptible to racist appeals, and highly emotional in behavior. Their ecstatic Marxism is a far cry from either the scholasticism of Marx or the organizational single-mindedness of Lenin. Moreover, the experience of several years of independence has had a chilling effect on those who originally saw in the new nations an expression of a more humane vision and an example for others. In many of the new states, the ruling elites have restricted liberty on the ground that such restriction is necessary to fight inequality by eliminating privilege on the home front and by mobilizing national efforts to bridge the widening gap between the nation and the outside world. The passion for equality has, in some places, been debased into a racial nationalism that finds its expression in the expulsion of non-native tribesmen, Chinese from Indonesia, Asians from East Africa, and more generally in a xenophobic and even racial resentment of the developed white world as the principal exploiter. The new political elites have shown a strong propensity toward conspicuous consumption, at some expense to their social consciousness. The problem of equality poses itself rather differently in the more developed and prosperous countries. There, particularly in the United States, it has taken the form of opposition to bigness in institutions and vested interests. Opponents of bigness argue that the political process is deceptive because the one man, one vote formula merely obscures the underlying inequality of power between the individual and, for example, the corporations. More specifically, the notion of equality, rather than that of liberty, has been at the heart of the civil rights struggle in the United States. Formal liberty has been gradually and painfully obtained by the blacks with the passage of the civil rights legislation, particularly legislation guaranteeing the right to vote. That liberty, however, hardly assures the blacks equality in America, and the black man's struggle today is to obtain the equality that the white man already possesses. Defining that equality is precisely what perplexes the college president or the city manager, to whom liberty has traditionally been synonymous with equality. The social tensions in the developed world, and this is true of some communist countries as well as of more pluralistic societies, highlight the difficulty of seeking equality purely on the external and materia plane. After several centuries of social activism, which emphasized the external man, contemporary man in the advanced industrial countries confronts a crisis of self-definition, of which he finds no satisfactory answers in either established religion or ideology. With the gradual fading of nationalist and ideological passions, inner certitude and external commitment have yielded to inner ambiguity and external uncertainty. Syncretic belief. When Michel Foucault proclaimed the death of man, he was expressing, in almost Nietzschean terms, the pessimism inherent in the reaction against Promethean ideologies. That reaction, in turn, reflects the scientific complexity of modern society, which stimulates a feeling of futility and impotence on the part of the individual. Foucault's views, associated with a school of thought called structuralism, have been characterized by a critic as the ideology of contemporary technocracy. For Foucault sees man as the object of a process which deprives him of any autonomy and rules him impersonally, according to a structural dynamic. The rejection of conscious history, thus striking at the heart of the ideological religious approach that has dominated Western thinking, is itself a reflection of the contemporary crisis in values, assumptions, and beliefs, and of the collapse of all integrated and simultaneously purposive historical interpretations. Centuries ago, in the great religions, man defined the norms that ought to guide the relations among men. Now, for the first time in recorded history, man is beginning, though just beginning, to liberate himself from the oppressive struggle to survive as a physical being. This has prompted a renewed concern with the more elusive spiritual aspects of existence. It has also created a state of agitation in which systematic dialogue increasingly breaks down because of the lack of shared assumptions. Naturally, this is especially true of the intellectual community, though the reaction gradually communicates itself to the body politic. As a consequence, the majority of people abide by procedural political order only as long as that order works, but they have less and less internal commitment to it. The passive behavior of the French people during the May 1968 collapse of political order is a case in point. To be sure, there is much discussion today of the need to reassert human values, of the priority of man against the tyranny of political despots or dehumanizing technocrats. But in our time, as opposed to the situation in eras when religion or ideology was dominant, the means, the forms, and the inner significance of these goals remain extraordinarily undefined. The International Philosophical Congress in Vienna in 1968 was, for example, dominated by the view that contemporary philosophy must be in the forefront of the struggle, but how it was to contribute was never specified. It is doubtful, therefore, whether the growing concern with the abstract and the spiritual, and even the evidences of new interest in religiosity, in other words, all matters subsumed under the term the quality of life, will in the near future lead to the emergence of new formal ideologies or religions. Scientific complexity and skepticism, reinforced by the impressionistic effects of increased reliance on audiovisual communication, television, work against the systematic and dogmatic qualities of an ideology. In this sense, it is therefore right to speak of the end of ideology. Religion and ideology were part of an age in which reality was still dogmatically compressible into intellectualized compartments. Both were reinforced by the urgent desire to translate the ideal into the real. What more probably lies ahead is a turn toward more personal, less structured, more subjectively defined attempts at a synthesis of the scientific and the spiritual. Though perhaps nothing quite so mystical as the Teilhard de Chardin's thinking. In any case, this appears to be the trend among contemporary Christian and revisionist Marxist thinkers. Though it is individually enriching, there is the danger that this development might work against the durability of liberal democracy. Intellectual confusion and political disagreement, to say nothing of simple insecurity, might well stimulate a search for external sources of stability, which would take the form of either repression or the bestowal of confidence on a dominant personality. Moreover, a society that carries eclecticism to the point where not only the total culture, but the individual consciousness becomes a mere congeries of disassociated elements, will find it impossible to make a collective decision as to what man shall make of man. A leader can then be a substitute for the integrative tasks of society, which are otherwise performed by either a formal or an implicitly shared ideology. In the absence of social consensus, society's emotional and rational needs may be fused. Mass media make this easier to achieve. In the person of an individual who is seen as both preserving and making the necessary innovations in the social order. Given the choice between social and intellectual disorder, and by this is not meant anything that even approaches a revolutionary situation, and authoritarian personal leadership, it is very probable that even some present constitutional and liberal democratic societies would opt for the latter. The temptation to choose security as an alternative to complexity may grow in the years ahead, because the end of ideology, far from diminishing the importance of ideas and ideals in politics, is ushering in an age in which abstract issues concerning the meaning of personal and social life are again becoming central. It is precisely because institutionalized beliefs no longer both confine and define the framework of the dialogue that the dialogue is becoming more intense and far-ranging. The result is a renewed conflict of ideas, but not of institutionalized ideologies. Renewed interest in religiosity, but not in organized religions. In this new and passionate dialogue, established and widely used terminologies are increasingly useless. Terms such as capitalism, democracy, socialism, and communism, even nationalism, are no longer adequate to provide relevant insights. In ideologically dominated societies, such as the communist nations, this inadequacy expresses itself more and more in even overt attacks on the official ideology. In societies with looser, more implicit values, it prompts a search for some acceptable and relevant framework. In both cases, the accent is on the need to combine the previously dominant emphasis on external man with renewed attention to his inner life. In both cases, as was true of Marxism in the industrial age, there is the felt need for a new intellectual synthesis. It is symptomatic of our age that despite its intense turbulence, it has not produced a relevant concept of revolution, a strategy of action designed to replace operative institutions and values with a new set, that is, both a method of change and the substance of that change. The industrial age did produce such a concept, Marxism, and it was later applied to countries in the process of industrialization. There is no such theory available to the post-industrial societies, nor has the New Left succeeded in providing one. Moreover, whereas in the past ideologies of change gravitated from the developed world to the less developed areas, thereby stimulating imitation of the developed world, Today, the differences between the two worlds are so pronounced that it is difficult to conceive of a new ideological wave originating from the developed world and rapidly acquiring relevance for the underdeveloped nations. Total integrative revolutions were possible because integrative ideologies provided a framework for total change and reconstruction. The integrative ideology was, in itself, a reflection of an age in which authority rested on clearly established beliefs and institutions. The Communist Party, with its claim to infallibility, was thus the epitome of an age of integrated grand visions and authoritarian institutions. Rapid scientific change, the massive educational explosion, and the intense communications implosion are all factors that make for highly volatile beliefs and reactions, and create a situation in which subjective feelings are more important than collective commitment to a blueprint for social action and organization. Accordingly, for the present, both the fragmentation-unification tensions that are stimulated on the political, economic, and intellectual planes by the gap between the technological and electronic age and the persistence in a new era of institutions and social forms derived from another age point toward a time of turbulence rather than toward a time of fundamental revolution. The more developed world is facing a crisis of its liberal democratic consensus. The communist world is finding it difficult to adapt its ideology. The third world seeks a frame of reference in a modified form of socialism that substitutes emotion for orthodoxy. In the past, the world lived in an environment of compartmentalized uniformity. Agrarian societies, basically similar in socio-economic structure, but differentiated in religions and cultures, were isolated from one another. Today, differentiated socio-economic realities, existing in an intellectual context of crumbling religions and ideologies, overlap perceptually. The psychic certitude of the past thus gives way to psychic tension. Confidence of righteousness yields to feelings of guilt or resentful inferiority. It is possible that in the present phase of intellectual turmoil, there are, for the first time, the seeds of a globally relevant perspective. The assertively universalist ideologies of the 19th century were, in fact, highly parochial in their origins, and thus they quickly merged with nationalism. This turned out to be particularly true of communism under Stalin. The seemingly inner-oriented ideas and ideals that dominate, in a highly unstructured manner, the current dialogue are in fact much more concerned with the universal problems of man and with the reintegration of the spiritual and the material. Man's vision of himself was at first highly primitive and fragmentary, reflecting thousands of small cultures. Out of these eventually emerged several religions with universal aspirations, though each was still culturally and territorially confined. The age of secularism gave rise to a more political vision, in which nationalism, elevated into a universal principle, was combined with largely European-derived ideologies that aspired to universal applicability. Whether our phase is a transition or the beginning of a more fundamental disintegration is likely to be very much influenced by what happens in the two major societies of our time, the United States and the Soviet Union, and by what happens to the two major contemporary visions of the modern world, liberalism and communism.